On a bare rock in the North Atlantic, two men walked up on a pair of birds that could not fly and did not run away. One of the men described it afterwards, plainly, to a researcher who wrote it down. He said the bird made no cry. He took it by the neck. That was the end of the Great Auk in 1844. Everyone knows a version of that story. Almost nobody knows that the same bird was being eaten in Europe long before there was a Europe. Cleaned auk bones lie in the ashes of Neanderthal cooking fires. So, the list of animals we hunted out of existence does not start with sailors and museum collectors. It starts about 125,000 years ago, and the sailors are only the bottom of the page. You cannot say every name on that list in one sitting, and that is the most useful thing about it. So walk it instead, oldest entry first, and watch what refuses to change. Start in Germany, at the edge of an old lake called Neumark Nord. Straight-tusked elephants stood there, the largest land animals of their whole age, heavier than any elephant alive today, and their bones carry cut marks left by stone tools. Now look at which ones were killed. Adult males, the biggest, strongest, most dangerous animal in the whole herd, chosen again and again. Nobody scavenges like that. That is shopping. So, how much meat is one of those? Enough to break your idea of what these people were. Butchered properly, a single adult male carried the day's food for something like 2,500 adults. Which left researchers with an awkward choice, because Neanderthals are supposed to have lived in small scattered bands. Either they gathered in numbers nobody had imagined, or they had already worked out how to store meat for months. Neither of those is a small thing to be wrong about. Then the bear. How many were out there? The cave bear was as heavy as a grand piano, and it was mostly a vegetarian, which somehow makes it worse. In one Swiss cave, diggers took cave bear remains out of the ground by the tens of thousands. Not bones, skeletons. The species held on until the coldest stretch of the Ice Age, but its numbers had already started falling much earlier, from around the time our own species first walked into its valleys. So, is every name on this list actually ours? No. And that is where this gets uncomfortable rather than simpler. The woolly rhinoceros wore a horn on its nose longer than the horn of any rhino alive today, and it went out while the world was warming. Ancient DNA says the weather did most of the work. It also says that taking roughly one animal in 10 out of every generation was enough to stop the survivors from spreading into the new ground that had just opened for them. You never have to wipe out a species. You only have to keep a hand on it while the ground moves under its feet. So, what does one of these encounters actually look like from a step away? In a bog in Washington state, there is a mastodon rib with a spear point still buried inside it. The point was carved from the bone of another mastodon and sharpened by hand to a needle. Here is the detail worth stopping on. The rib had grown back around the wound. That animal was speared, walked away, and lived long enough to heal. Somebody hunted it and lost. You probably picture Extinction as a wall in a museum with names cut into the stone, finished, behind glass, safely closed a long time ago. It is not a wall, it is a bill. It has been open the whole time, added to at the bottom in the same handwriting for longer than our species has had a name for itself, and the earliest lines on it are so faint that we only recently learned how to read them. Now go out to the islands, because an island runs this whole process at speed, in front of witnesses. And what happens to an animal that was never on our menu at all? New Zealand grew the largest eagle that has ever existed. Its hind claw was the size of a tiger's. It hunted the giant flightless birds walking around below it, animals that outweighed it 15 times over, and it killed them by striking down onto the pelvis and pinning them to the ground. People came ashore and ate the giant birds. And the eagle, which had never harmed a human being except in the stories they told about it afterwards, simply ran out of food and went out behind them. That is the part a list of names never shows you. Some of these animals we never hunted at all. We just ate what they ate. So, how strange does a place get when nothing there can eat you? Madagascar had a lemur the size of a gorilla. Not a lemur that climbed like one. A lemur far too heavy for branches, that came down and moved along the ground on all fours. It was still alive when the first canoes landed on the west coast of the island. It is not alive now, and the distance between those two sentences is short enough to be embarrassing. How many bodies does it take before a coincidence stops being one? On Cyprus, under a rock shelter on a cliff above the sea, Someone counted the remains of more than 370 dwarf hippos, mixed in with burnt bone and worked flint, exactly at the moment people first reached the island. Archaeologists still argue about that pile, and the argument is a fair one. The bones could have collected there on their own. What nobody argues about is the timing. The hippos stop where the flint starts. So what else was doing the killing, if not the spear? Because plenty of it was not the spear. People arrived carrying fire that changed what grew, dogs that could run anything down, and rats that ate whatever nested on the ground. On more than one island, the animal that finished a species was not the human at all. It was whatever came ashore standing next to him. Then there is Australia, which is where the argument gets loudest and where the list is at its most honest. That continent held a marsupial the size of a rhinoceros, a plant eater heavier than any pouched animal before or since, and a predator that weighed no more than a woman and bit harder than an African lion, killing with a hooked thumb claw and a windpipe-crushing snap that took under a minute. Both were gone within a few thousand years of people arriving. So does the case hold up everywhere? Here is the honest part, the part a good argument has to carry. For the largest of those animals, there is still no confirmed butchery site anywhere. The single most quoted piece of evidence, a tooth scored with cut marks, was re-examined not long ago and handed to a native cat instead. So the biggest name in the room is on this list on timing, not on a wound. Say that out loud, because a case you cannot state honestly is not worth making. So why does none of this read like a war? Because from the inside, it never looked like one. It looked like dinner, on a good day, in a place where an animal happened to be easy to reach. Nobody in any of these stories thought they were writing the last line about anything. So how recent does this list actually get? Now come forward to something you would recognize on sight. The aurochs was the wild bull that every cow on Earth is descended from, standing at the shoulder taller than the man who hunted it, carrying horns longer than his leg. It was hunted for so long and by so many that at the end it had bodyguards. Killing one became a privilege of kings, then of one king, and the last herd on Earth lived in a single guarded forest in Poland. There were 4 of them left. The last one died in that forest of old age, roughly a decade after Shakespeare was buried. Not in prehistory, not in some other world. In the century of printed books and telescopes, a wild animal that people had been painting on cave walls quietly stopped existing, and the paperwork survives. So how does a list like this actually end? On a rock off Iceland. 2 men, both named in the record, Jon Branson and Sigurður Islifsson, sent out by a collector who wanted specimens because the bird was becoming rare. Read that sentence again. It was killed at the end precisely because there was almost none of it left. The egg the pair had been sitting on did not survive the visit either, which brings the whole thing round in a circle. The bird those 2 men strangled on that rock is the same bird whose picked clean bones sit in the ashes of Neanderthal fires in Europe before our species had ever set foot there. The first name on this list and the last name are the same animal. Something ate great auks in the middle of an ice age. Somebody ate the last 2 while a merchant waited for delivery. Every other name in this story fits between those 2 meals. So the honest answer to what we hunted to extinction is not a list. Elephants that could feed a small town, a bear the size of a piano, a rhinoceros, a mastodon, an eagle that pulled down animals 15 times its weight, a lemur that walked on the ground, hippos on a Mediterranean island, the wild bull behind every cow in every field you have ever driven past, and a bird that could not fly and never learned to fear a boat. The list is not a monument, and it was never closed. It is still open at the bottom, in the same handwriting, and the last line is not carved yet.